Hi everyone, welcome to week 2 of Reading Poverty by America by Matthew Desmond. And I want to talk about two things tonight, and those are tax expenditures and market structures. He touches on both of these in the book, but I want to go into them in a little more detail. So, tax expenditures. There's two main mechanisms by which the US government or any government can use money to promote certain activities. You can fund them directly, taxes are taken in, money is sent out. Or at the point where taxes would be taken in, you can stop and redirect that money back to the person who would otherwise pay taxes. And from an accounting perspective, I need to stress these are equivalent. If you don't take in that tax money, then you have to either cut spending somewhere else, raise taxes higher as the general starting tax rate before deductions, or run a larger deficit. Right? Like it has to be accounted for somewhere because it is money that you are foregoing taking in through your taxation system. So the question is, why do we have so many of these? Why do that as opposed to, in some ways, the more straightforward and more easy to talk about and to promote benefit is to say, hey, we just gave people money to go to college or to save for college, rather than we gave people a tax preference that prevents them from paying certain taxes they would have otherwise paid on a 529 savings account, right? I think there's a couple of political incentives here. One is like Democrats get to promote some priorities they care about, and Republicans get to call it a tax cut and say the size of government is smaller. So like there's an overlap there. But also I think a key thing is that Congress doesn't have to pass them annually in the budget. Once it's in the tax code, it's just in the tax code. It wasn't until relatively recently that we even started getting like full accountings for tax expenditures in terms of how much they are every year. But it's not like they're voted on. The tax code is what it is. And so, however much you wind up spending through the tax code on these things, it's just there. It's not part of a continuing resolution, not part of the annual budgeting process. And the reason I wanted to go a little bit deeper on tax expenditures is because they're really big. 1.3 trillion is the estimate for 2019, and that's bigger than Social Security and quite a bit larger than non-defense discretionary spending, which is that bucket of programs that we mostly all are arguing about spending for like every budget cycle. Defense as well. Like Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security, all of this is automatically sent out. And tax expenditures, which are in the tax code, are automatically sent out. And then we spend the whole budget processing arguing about defense discretionary and non-defense discretionary. Now, obviously, like those are still huge amounts of money, and it matters. But if you're looking at, the government in its entirety and where money is going, you want to perhaps start with tax expenditures because it is actually the largest category. Okay, the other reason to talk about this in the context of a unit on class is because the spending through tax expenditures is going to different people than spending through non-defense discretionary spending. Over half of it goes to the top fifth of the income distribution. Almost a quarter of it goes just to the top 1%. And that's because, we have these benefits and they're sort of hidden in the tax code. So like people aren't going around complaining that, oh, we're giving away so much money to wealthy people through the mortgage interest deduction and the charitable contribution deduction and state and local sales tax deduction, etc. Right? So, a few of these do go evenly across the board, or one really, the earned income tax credit, as you can see on this slide, has a more progressive distribution where most of it goes to folks at the bottom of the income layer. But a lot of the exclusions, employment-based health insurance is a huge one. Like we talk about government's role in health insurance and how much government spends, and we seem to leave this out, but this is the one that, the majority of people in the US have healthcare through their employer, and there's a tax deduction for that. Like money is coming from the government in the form of not being collected at tax time and thus directly routed back instead of going to the government and then coming back. But it's still there, encouraging and upholding the current system. So like one reason it's hard to have independent insurance outside of your employer is because you don't get this tax break, right? Net preferential tax rates on capital gains and dividends is of course a big one, and a big reason this skews so heavily towards the top 1% when you look at these in aggregate. But also the charitable contribution deductions skew very heavily. Mortgage interest, bigger wealthier individuals have larger houses, larger mortgages, owe more on state and local taxes, and deduct that, right? So, you can see sort of here we have this skew of resources. And then we've talked before about you can ask, and people, if the benefit they're getting from the government is in the form of a tax expenditure, they'll often be unaware that they're actually getting a benefit from the government. And this is a bit of a problem because it skews everyone's view of what the government actually does and is doing and is promoting. Okay, the other thing I wanted to talk about is that market structures also will say predistribute income. We talk a lot about redistribution through taxes and transfers. So you tax high-income individuals, send the money to low-income individuals through programs like Social Security, Welfare SNAP, etc. This is your basic, welfare state redistribution. But the initial gains are also a function of how you set up markets. Markets are not something that has just one inherent setup, right? Like they're based around this idea of we have trade among individuals freely under certain rules, like don't break contracts is a very basic rule. But you also have, macroeconomic rules that set like what is the federal funds rate, what are we doing in terms of aggregate demand, are we doing anything on the supply side, etc. And when the labor market is tight, and as it has been in the past 2 years, like at or under 4%, you actually see inequality reversing and coming down. Wage gains have been higher in the bottom quintile than the top quintile. And it's because of that competition for labor among employers at the bottom, where like all of a sudden people have bargaining power because you're in a different macroeconomic situation, and therefore people are able to make more money. And that changes the sort of initial distribution. Like we think of this as neutral. It is not neutral. The rules change how much money goes to who based on how your economy is set up, even within the basic framework of we're going to have free and voluntary trades, right? Financial regulations and structure affect how big the financial sector is, how much risk it's allowed to take on. Patents and copyrights. We've talked about this. They may be necessary for innovation, although there may be other ways, but there's nothing written in stone that says they should be 20 years as opposed to 10 years or 30 years if you think that would supercharge innovation somehow, right? These are decisions we make that affect who gets what money, why. CEO pay is largely based on benchmarking against similar CEOs, and this is largely based on our structure of corporate governance. There's nothing inherent that says it has to be this way. Highly paid professions often put up barriers to entry. Doctors and lawyers, good examples of this, restricting the number of resident slots, making it particularly difficult to become a lawyer. And I want to note, like there are in fact good reasons we want some sort of qualification, certification for doctors and lawyers, right? This isn't purely a rent-seeking maneuver to say we want some sort of certification. But the fact remains that we have often artificially restricted this, in particular with regards to doctors and lawyers from other countries having any sort of ability to come and transfer and compete in the market to offer lower paid services to people who need medical care and legal advice. Whereas you see that all the time. Like if I want to buy a car and I want to buy it more cheaply, I have the option of buying cars from anywhere in the world, right? But I can't seek legal advice from anywhere in the world. You can't, I suppose there are ways to go and get medical care in other places in the world, namely traveling there in general. But for the most part, like you can see how there have been barriers for white collar professions, but not as much for manufacturing in order to protect them from competition. And these are some of the rules that are written into the way the market functions. And then of course, unions play a big role in determining the distribution of wages. Unionized shops within the same industry have much higher wages than non-unionized shops, and the rules around how unions form and how they're structured affects this sort of distribution. So I've got a couple of discussion questions for us. Looking forward to a good discussion with everyone on Slack this week.